less every year if we match the average spending of Canada's 3 largest provinces, Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia. Alberta would have $3.7 billion surplus instead of a $6.7 billion deficit just by bringing our spending in line with that of our peers. Folks, this may not be an entirely easy process, but Albertans have given us a clear indication that they expect us to make the tough decisions, that we will rebuild our province's stalled economy and set the stage for fiscal sustainability for generations to come. Speaking of strengthening the economy, I'm proud to note that I'll be tabling a motion in the House this week that calls upon the members of the Assembly to support our best-in-class oil and gas resources. We're all aware that Alberta's energy industry operates with the best environmental and human rights standards in mind. This is not a partisan statement, it's a fact. However, recently, we've seen Canadians denied the right to wear clothing that celebrates all that our oil and gas industries contribute to Canada within the country's top law-making institutions. I'm proud to say that we have a plan to make sure that never happens in the People's House in the province of Alberta. A deep understanding of our natural resource industries and just how transformational they can be for a community also underpins the proposed Bill 14, the first bill to be tabled in the legislature during the fall sitting, the Alberta Indigenous Opportunities Corporation Act. Our government intends to be full and equal partners in addressing the social and economic issues faced by Indigenous Albertans. That means creating a strong foundation of practical, sustainable prosperity for these communities. We will support Indigenous Albertans in their desire to be full partners in the resource projects that affect them in the spirit of reconciliation, inclusion, and opportunity. In my capacity as Minister of Environment and Parks, I also have the pleasure of introducing TIER, the Technology, Innovation, and Emission Reduction Program, for consideration by the Assembly. In the spring, we were pleased to repeal the NDP's carbon tax on ordinary Albertans. TIER represents a novel but practical approach to addressing emissions. The program will address the province's largest emitters, responsible for about 60% of Alberta's emissions. Revenue generated by TIER will go into funding pure and applied research that can help us reduce emissions in Alberta, Canada, and around the world. We estimate that the program will reduce emissions by approximately 40 to 45 megatons. And one additional piece of proposed legislation I want to make note of is an Alberta version of Clare's Law, which, if passed, will represent an important tool in fighting against domestic violence. Clare's Law allows individuals at risk of domestic violence to have a fuller awareness of an intimate partner's previous history of domestic violence and violent acts in specific situations. To many Albertans, having been victimized by their domestic partners, our government is committed to helping the province's most vulnerable, including victims and potential victims of domestic violence. This is by no means an exhaustive list of the promises we've made to Albertans that we are excited to fulfill over the course of the fall sitting with the support of the Assembly. We're excited to get back to business of making life better for all of the province's residents and to lay a foundation for an Alberta that is stronger and freer than ever. And with that, I'm happy to take your questions.
Minister, will there be legislation this session to deal with public sector salaries and jobs?
At this stage, there is no legislation planned to deal with public sector salaries and jobs. We'll see how the fall sitting progresses in the conversations that will be happening in regards to those type of negotiations, but at this stage there's nothing planned.
What about the Farm Freedom Safety Act? Is that coming in this session?
The Farm Freedom Safety Bill will come in this session. I don't have the exact date yet, but it will be earlier than later.
What kind of private members' bills are we going to see this session?
Well, I haven't looked at too many of the private members' legislation. I'm a large P parliamentarian, and as a member of Her Majesty's Executive Council, I see private members' business as the business of the Chamber of the whole, and government caucus and opposition caucus members. And so, generally, we, as we made clear and reinforced with a motion to the Chamber this past spring sitting, those will be handled through a free vote process, and so we'll see what members bring forward, and I'll listen to them with interest and determine how we cast votes on each one.
So as House Leader, you're not aware of what business is coming from your own caucus?
I haven't looked at most of the private members' business coming forward. We just not what is driven by the government House Leader. It's not a government activity. It's something that's driven by private members of the legislature. And so, no, I have not been involved in those.
There's a second piece of justice legislation called the
I'll come right back to you.
Girl Next Door Act, I think is that what it was? Or trying to remember what it was called now.
Yeah, saving the girl next door
Yeah,
at the
that,
human
I think there was some talk that
trafficking
might come in
center.
too, is that possible?
That's a priority of the government. It's inside the platform. Again, it's not in the first list of 14 that I have, but we are expecting to do a few more before the end of session that are just not as far along. So I can't speak to whether or not we will see it this fall or not, but it still remains a priority of the
There
government.
will be legislation on trespassing on rural farms.
There will be, for sure.
And given what we saw this morning on the Walter Bridge, might you change that and expand it to protests on, you know, like major arteries or something like that?
Well, I think that to confuse the two issues, while both important issues, would probably be tough to legislate. So we'll, the one that when it comes to trespassing on farms will proceed as promised and is being developed. But you know, we'll have a look at how opportunities arise and where Albertans may or may not need us to legislate on that. Where the reality is, you see people today protesting. We respect people's rights within democracy to protest. What we do not respect is them disturbing the peace and stopping people from getting to work. It's inappropriate, and I would submit to you, Dean, it's already against the law, and so we'll let the local law enforcement inside the city of Edmonton deal with it.
Is there any bill coming to deal with conscious rights in terms of abortion?
Not that I'm aware of. I could get back to you, though. As I said, I haven't looked at what different private members are working on.
Are there any bills dealing with abortion in any way, shape, or form?
There is no bills dealing with abortion that I am aware of in the short term. There is a motion, I believe, that will be a few weeks away coming from the NDP in regards to abortion. I haven't had any time to look at it, but I am aware of that. But I am not aware of a piece of legislation associated with abortion. But again, I don't speak for private members, and I haven't seen all their lists.
So you're basically saying you don't know if there's a bill coming or not. You didn't say no. You said you haven't heard.
I'm not aware and do not believe that there is a bill coming from government caucus members associated with abortion, but I'm not speaking for all government caucus members.
You referenced other provinces that are on average spending about $10 billion less than Alberta, the three major provinces. So does that mean we can expect a budget that has $10 billion less spending than the current budget?
No, we've been clear what you can expect in the budget. You can expect a budget where we follow through on our platform commitment to Albertans to maintain and protect essential frontline services while putting our province, on a path to balance by the end of this term. That's what the budget will show. I'm not going to speak to detailed numbers until the budget comes out.
Saying it was going to be difficult to do these kinds of changes. So I mean, what order of magnitude of decrease can we
The
expect?
Premier has been clear that we're not looking at difficulties and magnitudes associated with what you would have saw in the 90s. We don't believe that we're in a situation where we would have to go to that level of cuts. We think we can do this for protecting essential frontline services. We've been clear on that. But we've also been clear, and Albertans voted for it in overwhelming numbers, that we will put this province back on a path to balance. And if we do this now, we won't have to see those extreme levels of action that are required if we stayed on the path that the NDP had put us on.
You put out a statement on Friday, Jim Ellis.
Yep.
The three investigators said, it was put to the what else can the government do or take action in terms of getting money back or punitive action on Jim Ellis, maybe roll back his pension or something. I don't know if that's possible. What's your reaction to what you heard Friday? And will your government be taking action to get the money back or take action on Jim Ellis?
Well, I don't know, to be honest, legally if that's possible. Our government has already taken significant action on this prior to the reports even coming out. We, of course, have replaced the AER board and have begun both a governance and separately an operation and overall mandate review of the Alberta Energy Regulator, which is in progress. The board itself, I expect them to follow through on what has been recommended by all of the independent officers of the legislature. Let me be clear, from our government's perspective, this is completely inappropriate behavior. I don't think anybody could justify what Mr. Ellis had done. I think it's shocking that it was allowed to go on this long and shows a failure in leadership within the Alberta Energy Regulator, which is why we've made a change. Specifically to consequences for Mr. Ellis, I can't speak to that. I'm not a lawyer or somebody from law enforcement that can do that. But I do expect the interim board of the Alberta Energy Regulator to do everything possible to restore credibility in the AER and to take any action, if possible, against Mr. Ellis.
Do you know, based on your discussions with officials, did this have an impact on the long waits for oil well leases, that sort of thing? Did it really impact the other business of the AER?
I think when the leadership of the AER is clearly focused on benefiting themselves, focused on areas that are not within the mandate of the Alberta Energy Regulator, and then focused on what, the reports speak for themselves, focused on those actions within those reports that clearly they weren't doing the work that was necessary to make sure that our energy industry was operating at its full capacity within the environmental regulations that we need. I mean, I submit to you, Dean, anybody who's focused on that in a leadership role was not focused on doing what they were supposed to, so certainly it had to have some sort of an impact. Now, how do you quantify that would be, a different question.
Can you talk a little bit about TIER and how it will compare to the CCIR? What exact kinds of changes do you plan on making on emissions regulation there?
Well, we're not gonna, TIER legislation is actually written. It will, as I said, the number that we believe that we can get to with TIER is a reduction of 40 to 45 megatons.
Over what time period?
We're not gonna speak in details on the specifics of TIER until we announce it in a few weeks.
What bill number is it?
I do not have the bill number in front of me. The problem is because we start at 14, I think, so just give me a sec. I think you're looking at 17 or 18 probably. But I could be slightly off on that. And we will, I don't want to get into too much details of legislation that's already written until the opposition's had a chance to look at it.
It's 40 megatons compared to what or when?
Well, again, not compared to anything. We believe that TIER will reduce our emissions by 40 to 45 megatons.
Like from today
Today's
or
level.
from?
2000 and I'll get back to you on the frame that we moved it on. I believe it's 2013.
Written into that legislation, is there any kind of direction as to where the funds that you get for TIER go in terms of technology that you'd like to see boosted?
Correct. I mean, the platform promise is clear, and the legislation will comply with that, which is that a couple things. First off, the first $100 million will go into to the TIER fund, and then 50% of every dollar that is collected in TIER, therefore, that point forward will go into the TIER fund. The other 50% will go into to general revenue for deficit reduction, as stated in the platform, as well as to fund what's commonly referred to as the war room. The money itself, the industry has been consulted on it. That's what we've spent a lot of time over the summer doing, and it will go into technology. Let me be very clear on that, into innovation, into research, into projects that we think will have the biggest impact in the shortest period of time on emissions. It will not go into rebate programs. It will not go into light bulbs and shower heads. It will not go, the portion that is in TIER will not go into general revenue to pay for projects like sea trains and those type of things. It'll be focused purely on technology, as we promised.
Will there be legislation to extend, say, or take action on Bill 9? So, for example, October 31st, the unions get their arbitration again. What's going to happen with that? Are you going to introduce legislation, or will you allow arbitration to go ahead after Halloween?
I have nothing on my list associated with Bill 9 or labor legislation at this stage. You have to, discuss with Minister Taves what would trigger something like that to take place, but my understanding is that they're going through the process, and nobody's asked me to bring any legislation of that nature to the floor, as I said.
Another question would be for Taves, but it would probably come to you through Cabinet. McKinnon report recommended on September 30th you lift the freeze on pay and bonuses for non-union staff. Is Cabinet done that? Is Cabinet doing that?
I will refer you to Mr. Taves as far as details of negotiations. But again, our focus this fall will be on getting a budget in that will bring us to balance. And that's the direction as you speak to the House Leader. My job is to get the budget through. And I'm not aware of any legislation that's referring to what you're referring to.
But are there any other bills that have to come before the budget, as part of the budget? That's something that the Finance Minister alluded to, that perhaps there might be other bills, other pieces?
Before the budget?
Yeah, or in tandem with the budget?
There will be some legislation to implement some of the changes that are coming forward within the budget. Again, pretty detailed pieces of legislation that will need to be given to the opposition, but not in relation to what Mr. Bennett's asking me about.
So there is legislation coming in the next 2 weeks to help implement the budget?
No.
No, misheard that?
You misheard that, yeah. There is no budget, or there is no bills coming out in advance of the budget to implement the budget. Any bills associated with the budget would take place with the budget or shortly after the budget.
Okay. And can you give us a sense what's coming in the next 2 weeks then? Is it the Farm Freedom, is it, because we've got one.
Well, we're gonna open for sure with the Indigenous Corporations Act, which will be the big piece of legislation. The second week, we'll open up with a bill that I'm bringing around modernizing grazing lease rates to protect the cattle industry from countervail in the United States, and to modernize how we rent out grazing leases inside this province. You've heard Clare's Law. I expect you'll see Clare's Law likely the first week, if not the second. Tier will be early in that list. Like, I'm not quite sure if we'll get it just before the budget or just after. Those will be the type of things you'll see in the early days.
Sorry, didn't I hear there's supposed to be one on private property too? Is that coming? Something to do with
The
private property?
The trespassing
That's
one, yeah.
trespassing.
The trespassing one, I will bring that as soon as it's ready. If we believe that it's ready in the first week, it'll come. If not, it'll come as soon as it's ready. It's kind of a late addition, as you know, and we'll have to make sure it's written before we can get
Are you
there.
packing your toothbrush? Are you expecting another set of perhaps around the clock?
Listen, I've always told you, we'll do exactly what we have to do to get the legislative agenda through the House. If the opposition wants to spend their time wasting their time going around in circles, we'll wait them out and we'll do it. With that said, as I said at the end of last session, I won't allow them to abuse taxpayer dollars in the future, just going on and on endlessly. And you can expect that I'll bring a standing order package, which we're already discussing with the opposition. We'll see where that ends up. That will, one, protect the opposition's ability to do their job as the official opposition. I respect that role within our parliamentary system. I was proud to serve within that role. But we'll also stop the endless opportunity to just stop Albertans' bills from making it through the legislature. Similar to probably what you see in Saskatchewan, that will make it clear that there is a point where a debate comes to an end, and Alberta MLAs will have an opportunity to vote on legislation.
Hey, guys,
You lost me
one
there.
more.
Are you doing something besides time allocation? Is that what you said you're bringing in?
As I said at the end of last session, we will bring standing order changes to stop outright taxpayer abuse by the opposition by attempting to keep the legislature going for all times. That's a unique thing here in Alberta. If you go to places like Saskatchewan and other provinces, there's clear end dates on legislation, and we will bring in some sort of standing order change along those lines.
The
Sorry, I
Choice
have
in
to ask you.
Education
Go ahead.
Act, the Choice in Education Act, is that coming this fall, and when-ish?
The Choice in Education Act,
Yeah, I think that's what it's called.
I'm not sure if we're talking about, I'm not aware of some Choice Education Act. It's not on my list. I'm just looking at my guys. No, it's not on the list. So unless I just want to make sure we're talking about the same thing, but
Yeah,
I don't have a bill called the
parental-
Choice in Education Act.
Parental rights and enshrining in law a parent's right to.
That's not on the legislative agenda for this fall. It is in the platform, I don't remember the exact wording, but that's not on my agenda for this fall.
Hey, Catherine?
Oh, yeah, I was gonna say, is there any time constraints with getting this tier legislation passed? Because I know there's the court case, and the court case is built around the fact that we're going to have this tier levied, so it's an equivalent to the carbon tax. Is there any time constraints on when this needs to?
The platform commitment is that it will be in place by January 1st, 2020, which coincides actually with when a federal backstop would take place. Now, we need to be clear that we're talking about two different backstops. There's the industry backstop, and then a backstop associated with what would be more commonly referred to as the carbon tax. We need to actually have tier up and running in advance of January 1st, so to accomplish this from an accounting perspective, and I expect that it will be up and running sometime in November.
Mr. Can I ask you, the Saskatchewan thing, I'm sorry, I missed the last day of the last session, just.
That's fair.
So in Saskatchewan, what do? They say, okay, when we bring in a bill, the debate has to end by an X date, is that what
Correct.
this is?
Correct.
So when you bring in a bill this session, it's gonna say, this bill now, no matter what happens, will pass within 2 weeks of first reading or something, is that how that works?
Now, in Saskatchewan, they have a minimum amount of hours that have to be debated on a bill that the opposition has available to them, but they have clear end dates of session, and as long as everything is tabled and given those opportunities for the opposition to participate in debate for the hours that is put in the standing order, then yes, it goes to an automatic vote at the end of session.
So, so even if let's say you're in the middle of second reading on the last day of session, what happens? Boom, okay, now it's
That's
third.
correct.
It's automatically into third or something, there's no
Correct.
debate on third.
Correct. In Saskatchewan, what would happen is then all the votes just take place for everything that's left on the agenda, and it goes to the House.
sorry, December 5th or something? So
I think the end date on the calendar right now is
so
December 5th.
effectively, every bill that you bring forward now, as long as it has a minimum number of hours of debate or something, or, like, for example, you can't bring in a bill a day before the end of session.
Correct. There's rules against that too, and there would be rules within our final standing order package on that they have to be tabled within an appropriate period of time to accommodate all those hours of debate.
So that's never been done in Alberta, has it?
No, absolutely not.
So are you worried that might be, I mean, that's.
No, I'm not worried.
Tradition is-
I'm not worried at all.
Not gonna get the debate we need on some of these things?
No, I'm not worried at all. We'll protect the ability for the opposition to debate. What I heard clearly from Albertans is, particularly after the last legislative session, is to make sure that we don't allow the opposition to abuse taxpayer dollars, to prolong the system beyond what is reasonable, which is why other legislatures in the country have already tackled this issue.
No matter what, we know when we're finishing here.
No, not necessarily, Dean, because the issue is that you could end up with a piece of legislation that is tabled later. There's different ways within fluidity of that. You can't, if the government doesn't table everything in Saskatchewan on time and doesn't give the adequate amount of time for the opposition to debate, then the end date gets extended. You couldn't just dump it all in the last couple of days.
We're following the Saskatchewan model, but I want to see.
It'll
what's
be
going on.
similar, yes.
And that's coming the first day, then, these standing order changes?
Haven't decided yet, but it will come soon.
Awesome, thanks, guys.
Bet.
Thank you.
Thanks.